Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
I'm really excited to get into this one today.
Yeah, me too. So I want you to imagine, just for a moment, that you and your community are being actively hunted.
Like a literal survival situation.
Exactly. A hostile army from your hometown has stolen all your property, they've driven you into exile, and right now they are marching to just wipe you off the map. It's a brutal existential war.
Right. The stakes are as high as they get.
And then a refugee from that exact enemy camp shows up at your borders asking for asylum. Now your governing text commands you to take her in, to protect her.
Which is already asking a lot in wartime.
Right. But then, and this is the part that is just incredible, it orders you to write a check to her combatant husband back in the enemy camp to fulfill the equity of their dissolved marital contract.
It's almost unbelievable.
You were literally commanded to send money to the people trying to kill you just to ensure a legal contract is honored with absolute justice.
Yeah, that is a staggering scenario to consider.
It's wild. And today, we are doing a deep dive into a 7th century text that demanded exactly that. We're exploring chapters 57 through 66 of the Qur'an.
Which is a profoundly ancient work, but man, it is going to force us to totally rethink how we handle power, vulnerability, and our enemies today.
Not to mention our own internal hypocrisies.
Yeah.
So to really grasp how radical commands like that were, and honestly still are, we have to understand the pressure cooker environment these specific chapters were born into.
We really do. Because these texts belong to what historians call the Medinian period.
Yeah.
And the context here is just everything.
It's not just theory anymore.
Exactly. This isn't a collection of like abstract philosophical musings written by some monk on a quiet mountaintop.
Right. I'm so glad you brought up the timeline. For anyone who maybe knows the broader history here, there is this massive structural shift between the earlier texts and these chapters.
A huge shift. Yeah.
Because in the earlier Meccan period, this community was this persecuted, really marginalized minority. I mean, they were being tortured and starved.
Jailed, yeah. It was pure survival mode.
So the texts from that era reflect that trauma. They're heavily focused on, pure theology, the nature of God, endurance, the afterlife.
But then they migrate. They move to the city of Medina.
And that changes the entire sociological landscape, doesn't it?
Completely. They move from being this small, oppressed, totally powerless group to actually forming a fledgling society. I mean, they essentially become a state.
Wow. So they have real authority now.
Yeah. So the tone, the content, the sheer focus of the text completely shifts. It moves from pure theology right into the gritty, complex, and honestly often ugly realities of governance.
It gets real very fast.
It does. We start seeing texts dealing with social equity, the ethics of warfare, macroeconomics, and the messy complexities of human relationships, like marriage and divorce.
I always think of it like a startup company, moving from the theory phase into actual day-to-day operations.
That's a great analogy, actually.
Like in the garage, it's all about the pure vision. But suddenly, you get funding, you move into an office, and you have to run a real company. Now you've got HR disputes, hostile competitors, payroll to meet.
You've got bad actors internally trying to embezzle funds.
Right. The vision has to survive the messy reality of execution. And what is so compelling to me about this shift in Medina is that to understand this new society they were building, we first have to understand how this text reshapes the very idea of what it means to be a spiritual person.
That is the foundational paradigm shift here. If you look at the late antique world of the 7th century, the dominant idea of ultimate piety, whether you were looking at Christian monastic traditions or various ascetic movements, it usually involved what the text calls monkery.
Monkery, right. Basically retreating from the world.
Exactly. The assumption was that the material world is inherently corrupt. It's dirty, it's a distraction. So to get close to the divine, you had to isolate yourself in a cave, swear off commerce, swear off marriage.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that ascetic impulse just a little bit because honestly, I get it. I mean, the world is messy.
Oh, absolutely.
Dealing with people, with business, with conflict, it's exhausting.
Yeah.
And morally compromising.
Yeah.
So the desire to just unplug and retreat to the woods sounds incredibly appealing.
It sounds super appealing. It's safe. But that is precisely what these chapters critique. Chapters 57 and 62 explicitly tackle this ascetic impulse and reject it.
Really? They just outright reject it?
Yes. They argue that true spirituality is not found by escaping the world, but by engaging with it justly. The text makes it clear that humanity is required to develop all of its faculties, intellectual, physical, economic, in the service of society.
So you can't just check out.
No, Islam in these chapters explicitly refuses to sanction monkery. A purely ascetic life leaves the vast majority of the human toolkit totally dormant.
And it does this with some of the most striking imagery I've ever encountered in an ancient text. Let's look at chapter 57. It's literally titled The Iron.
Yeah, the iron.
Like, when we think of ancient religious symbols, we usually think of incense or doves or light. But here, the text pairs three things together. The book, meaning divine revelation, the measure, which commentators translate as the balance or equity,
Yeah.
and the iron.
Right alongside each other.
It explicitly blesses iron, the heavy metal of civilization, industry, defensive weaponry. It places that right alongside spiritual equity.
The pairing is deliberate and it's profoundly pragmatic. If you look at the classical commentaries on this triad, they explain that you have the book to provide the moral foundation, right? And you have the measure, the scales, to ensure justice and equity in commerce and law. But why the iron? The commentary points out that without the iron, without the physical strength and defensive capability to protect the truth, the balance would perish.
Justice needs strength to uphold it.
Exactly. Force without justice is tyranny, but justice without force is just helplessness.
It's acknowledging that you can't just sit in a circle singing songs about justice and expect a fair society to materialize. You need the structural integrity, the iron, to enforce it.
And this integration of the practical, heavy reality of the world flows right into chapter 62, which discusses the Friday congregation.
Yeah, the Friday prayers are a fascinating case study in how this text balances the sacred and the secular. I was struck by how it diverges from the concept of a strict Sabbath that we see in other traditions.
It's a very different rhythm.
Because the believers are told that when the call to prayer is made on Friday, they need to leave their business. They have to literally shut down the shop, walk away from commerce, and gather for communal prayer.
Which seems to align perfectly with standard religious practice, right? Halt the secular to engage the sacred. But the defining worldview is established in the very next breath.
Once the prayer is ended, it says, disperse abroad in the land and seek of Allah's grace, meaning get back to work.
Yeah, go back to the marketplace.
But negotiate contracts, go build things. The sacred and the secular aren't at war with each other in this framework. They are the two legs you need to walk forward.
This rhythm is so essential. It demands engagement in the marketplace, but it insists on a mandated pause for spiritual communion so the soul doesn't starve while the wallet gets fat.
If you're listening to this on your commute or, sitting at your desk, think about how aggressively this ancient rhythm pushes back against the cultural obstacles we face today.
Oh, big time.
Modern hustle culture tells us that work and output are our ultimate worth.
Yeah.
If you aren't grinding 24/7, you're failing.
But then you have the flip side.
Right, modern wellness culture, which often preaches a modernized version of that 7th century monkery. It tells us to find peace, we need to unplug, escape, ignore the news, and just check out.
And this text looks at both of those extremes and says, no, both are evasions of your responsibility. You don't escape the world to be spiritual, and you don't lose yourself in the world to be successful.
And there's this highly targeted critique in chapter 62 directed at people who fail to synthesize this.
Especially
religious scholars.
The supposed spiritual elite. Yeah. The text critiques those who possess the sacred laws, who memorized all this divine knowledge, but fail to apply it in the marketplace. It compares them to an ass bearing books.
A donkey carrying a massive library on its back. I love that. The donkey is weighed down by the books, it's exhausted by the books, but it has absolutely no idea what wisdom is actually inside them.
It's a universally resonant concept. You find echoes of this in Stoic philosophy, where Epictetus mocks people who brag about understanding complex texts, but don't actually live virtuously.
We see it in modern mindfulness, too.
Exactly, warning against intellectualizing meditation without actually becoming a kinder person. Knowledge without applied real-world action makes you heavy, not enlightened.
So the practical question this leaves you with is, are you treating your own spirituality or your self-care as an escape hatch? Are you using your meditation app to numb out from your problems, or are you using that mental clarity to re-engage with your daily challenges more justly?
Stop being a donkey carrying a bunch of self-help books, basically.
Right. Start actually building something with iron and balance. And that transition from theory to practice is where the text pivots sharply, doesn't it?
It does. Because if true faith requires active, just engagement in the real world, the text doesn't let that remain a lofty theory. It immediately forces the society to apply this standard to its most marginalized and vulnerable members.
Which brings us to the next section of our deep dive. If we're going to talk about a society building itself with iron and balance, we have to look closely at who they are balancing the scales for. We have to look at the socioeconomic reforms.
And to appreciate the sheer shock value of chapters 58, 59, and 65, we really have to ground ourselves in the pre-Islamic Arabian customs of the 7th century.
Set the stage for us.
We are looking at a deeply patriarchal tribal society. Elites hoarded immense wealth through predatory lending. And the vulnerable women, orphans, the poor, had virtually no legal standing. They were property or collateral or just invisible.
The overarching principle established in these Medinian chapters is that a community's moral standing isn't judged by how many prayers it recites, but by how structurally sound its protections are for those exact vulnerable people.
Absolutely. And there is a highly specific story from chapter 58 titled The Pleading One that perfectly illustrates this. It centers entirely on one marginalized woman named Kaula.
Kalula bint Talaba. I was reading the historical context you provided for this, and the mechanics of her situation are horrifying when you unpack them.
They really are. Kawula was a woman whose husband, in a moment of intense anger, utilized an old Arab custom known as zihar. He basically said to her, "You are to me as the back of my mother."
Which sounds completely bizarre to our modern ears. What did uttering that specific phrase actually do in their legal system?
Legally and socially, it was a devastating loophole of patriarchal control. By saying that, the husband was declaring his wife was now forbidden to him from marital relations, but this did not constitute an actual divorce.
So she's completely trapped.
Entirely trapped. She was held captive in a state of social and legal limbo. She couldn't return to her family, she couldn't remarry, and she couldn't seek financial independence. It was a tool designed to punish women, leaving them destitute with absolutely no recourse.
It's just a cruel legal fiction. So what did she do?
Khawla does something incredibly audacious. She goes directly to the Prophet Muhammad, pleads her case, and actively argues with him about the injustice of her situation.
And what's fascinating is the Prophet's initial reaction. He hesitates. He essentially tells her, "I'm sorry, but I can't intervene." Why wouldn't he just change the law right then and there? He's the leader.
That hesitation is crucial because it highlights the nature of his leadership. He wasn't a monarch legislating on a whim. He was bound by existing social laws unless he received divine revelation to alter them. He tells her no law has been revealed regarding zihar, so his hands are tied.
But Kola refuses to accept this.
She keeps pleading, not just to him, but directing her complaint to God. And then the revelation comes down the opening of chapter 58.
The very first verse says, "Allah indeed knows the plea of her who pleads with you about her husband and complains to Allah." I need us to pause and let the gravity of that sink in.
It's profound.
In a hyper-patriarchal 7th century society, the divine text of the universe pauses the narrative of statecraft to explicitly say, I hear this specific marginalized woman complaining.
And it doesn't just offer her spiritual comfort, it initiates structural legal reform. The chapter explicitly abolishes the practice of zihar. It takes the side of the marginalized woman against the established power structure.
It legislates her freedom. It's a radical intervention. And this insistence on institutionalizing protections doesn't stop at marital law. We see it brilliantly illustrated in chapter 59, which deals with macroeconomics, specifically something called fey wealth.
Right. Fey is a highly specific economic category. It refers to wealth or resources acquired by the community without active warfare. So if a hostile tribe surrendered their resources without a battle, that wealth became fey.
Now, the standard operating procedure in the ancient world, and frankly much of the modern world, would be for the military leaders to divide those spoils among themselves.
Exactly. The ancient equivalent of the rich getting richer through state acquisitions. But the text steps in and completely upends the ancient economy of spoils. It dictates that this specific type of wealth must not be distributed among the elites.
Who does it go to?
It must be designated for the central treasury to specifically support the poor, orphans, the wayfarer, and refugees.
I want to read the exact rationale the text gives for this economic policy because it might be one of the most profound economic statements I've ever read. It says this wealth is routed to the poor, quote, so that it may not be a thing taken by turns among the rich of you.
It is an explicit legislated anti-monopoly mechanism.
It's an ancient blueprint for preventing extreme wealth inequality. It's looking at the natural tendency of human economies where capital tends to concentrate at the top and saying we cannot build a society where the money only circulates among the elites.
And notice the methodology here. The text isn't just encouraging people to be generous. It isn't leaving the survival of the poor up to the whimsical charity of the rich. It is institutionalizing a safety net into the fabric of the state's economy.
Creating a structural guardrail.
Exactly. And we see this exact same philosophy of structural guardrails applied to the dissolution of human relationships in Chapter 65, which deals with divorce.
Now, I want to tread carefully here because I think a lot of modern listeners might experience some friction when reading this section. Reading ancient rules about divorce and gender roles can feel uncomfortable or regressive when viewed exclusively through a 21st century lens.
This is where we need to exercise wisdom with discernment. We are looking at a society that was structurally patriarchal. We can't map our modern egalitarian frameworks onto a 7th century tribal desert society.
That's a fair warning.
However, if you evaluate the trajectory of this text relative to its context, it was radically progressive. Before these revelations, women could be discarded at will, driven out of their homes instantly with absolutely no financial support. Chapter 65 institutes strict legal rights where a void previously existed.
What kind of specific rights are we talking about here? How did it change reality on the ground?
First, it mandates a strict waiting period, the Ida, before a divorce can be finalized. This was a psychological cooling-off period designed to prevent rash, anger-driven separations and allow time for potential reconciliation.
That makes a lot of practical sense.
Furthermore, it lays down strict rules against driving women out of their homes during this period. The husband is legally obligated to provide housing. And crucially, it mandates that men must financially support pregnant or nursing divorcees without causing them hardship or trying to squeeze them financially.
So while it's absolutely operating within an ancient framework, the enduring wisdom here isn't necessarily about replicating 7th century mechanics perfectly today. The wisdom is the principle of institutionalizing protections for the vulnerable during moments of extreme power imbalance.
It's about recognizing who holds the power when a system or a relationship dissolves and putting boundaries on that power so it doesn't become destructive.
And that leads to a profound reflection for anyone listening right now. Think about your own life, your workplace, your business negotiations, or family dynamics. When you hold the leverage, when you have the power in a negotiation or a separation, how do you ensure the other party isn't left destitute or trapped?
Are you designing your wins so they don't crush the vulnerable?
Exactly. Do you leave a way out?
Yeah.
Managing your advantage ethically is the ultimate test of character.
But as difficult as it is to manage power ethically within your own community, it is infinitely more difficult to manage it when dealing with your enemies.
Which is exactly where the text takes us next. We see how aggressively the text builds safety nets inside their own walls. But the ultimate stress test for any society isn't how it treats its own people in peacetime. It's how those moral boundaries hold up when an army is marching to destroy you.
This brings us to the ethics of navigating conflict, enmity, and the other, found primarily in chapters 60 and 61.
Let's really set the stage for how dire the situation was in Medina at this point.
It cannot be overstated how precarious their existence was. The Muslim community in Medina is facing an existential multi-front threat. Externally, they are in a state of active, brutal war with the Quraysh, the elites of Mecca who had tortured them and forced them into exile. The Meccans aren't just angry, they're actively mobilizing armies to annihilate the Muslims completely.
But the threat isn't just external. They are surrounded by hostile forces locally, too.
Yes, internally and on their borders, they are dealing with treachery from certain neighboring tribes. Tribes who had entered into solemn peace treaties with Medina but were secretly conspiring with the Meccans, acting as a fifth column.
So the psychology of the community at this point has to be sheer paranoia. They're dealing with spies, betrayals, and massive armies marching toward them. It's high stakes, life or death.
Absolutely.
Now, history shows us that when a group is under this kind of extreme pressure, their texts and rhetoric usually become violently xenophobic. The mentality becomes, kill them all. Anyone who isn't us is the enemy.
That is the standard historical pattern of besieged societies. But that is emphatically not what we find in this text. Chapters 60 and 61 demand an astonishing level of ethical discipline. They insist that even in a state of existential threat, ethical boundaries toward the other must be fiercely maintained.
Let's dissect the distinction Chapter 60 draws, because it's so specific regarding who the enemy actually is.
The text first establishes the baseline of security. It strictly forbids friendly relations or military alliances with those who have actively made war on the Muslims and driven them from their homes. That's basic statecraft. You don't ally with the army trying to slaughter you.
Right, common sense.
But then it pivots. It explicitly states that God does not forbid showing kindness and dealing justly with non-believers who have not fought them on account of religion and have not driven them out of their homes.
I am blown away by the restraint of that verse. In the middle of a brutal, terrifying war, the text stops to say, do not paint everyone with the same brush. It forces a traumatized community to distinguish between active combatants and people who simply hold different beliefs.
It demands an extraordinary level of cognitive clarity. It forces the believer to separate theological disagreement from physical enmity. And this wasn't just a theoretical boundary, it had immediate practical applications. The title of Chapter 60, the examined one, refers to a specific historical crisis regarding refugees.
Right, these were women who were fleeing Mecca and seeking asylum in Medina.
Exactly. You have women arriving at the borders, fleeing the enemy camp. The text commands the Muslims to examine them. They had to ensure these women weren't spies sent by the Qur'an, which was a very real threat. But if their conversion or plea for asylum was deemed sincere, they were granted absolute protection. The text explicitly forbids sending them back to their persecutors.
That part makes sense. But then comes the part of this chapter that I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, which honestly left me speechless. The text commands the Muslims to grant these women asylum, but then it orders the community to return the dowries, the financial marital gifts, to the unbelieving Meccan husbands that these women were leaving behind.
Yes. Even though the marriages were effectively dissolved, and even though the husbands were in a state of active warfare against the Muslims, the original financial contract of the marriage still had to be respected. The Muslim state treasury essentially had to reimburse the enemy combatants.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. You are at war. The people on the other side have stolen your homes, confiscated your wealth in Mecca, and are trying to kill you. And your divine text tells you, hey, that refugee woman, cut a check to her husband back in Mecca to fulfill the equity of their contract. Why? Why prioritize the financial rights of an enemy who stripped you of your rights?
Because it demonstrates that justice is not dependent on the righteousness or the deservingness of the other party. If justice only applies when the other side plays fair, it isn't justice. It's just transactional convenience.
Wow.
The text is teaching them that you don't act justly because your enemy deserves it. You act justly because you are commanded to be a doer of justice. Your ethical center cannot be dictated by the bad behavior of your opponent.
That is a staggering level of ethical discipline. And how desperately do we need this modern translation today? We live in a hyperpolarized reality where it is incredibly easy and incentivized by algorithms to demonize an entire group based on the actions of their worst actors.
We constantly collapse the distinction between someone who simply holds a different worldview and someone who is actively causing harm.
We do. We view the world in binaries. We decide that if someone votes differently or thinks differently, they are devoid of humanity and deserve no fairness. And this ancient text is challenging us to draw strict, disciplined lines.
It really is.
So if you're listening, look at your own enemies list, whether that's a political faction, a rival department at work, or a personal conflict. Are you painting with too broad a brush? Are you projecting the sins of the most extreme members onto everyone? And most importantly, can you act with absolute justice, even financial justice, towards someone in an opposing camp, even when they aren't playing fair?
It's an incredibly high bar. But what is perhaps even more sobering is that while these chapters acknowledge the immense danger of the external enemy, they argue that the most lethal threat to a society isn't external at all. The real threat is an inside job.
I love how the narrative shifts here. You can build walls to keep the Meccans out, but you can't build a wall against your own rot. This brings us to the psychology of the internal enemy, hypocrisy, ego, and what the text calls the ultimate trial. So, a new internal faction emerges in Medina. Who are they?
To understand this faction, you have to look at the sociology of newly acquired power. In Mecca, you were only a Muslim if you truly believed, because the only thing it gained you was persecution and torture. There was absolutely no social advantage to faking belief.
Right.
But in Medina, everything changed. The Muslims were now the dominant political and military force. Suddenly, there was massive political and economic capital in being part of the in-group.
So it became profitable to join the club.
Exactly. And whenever belief becomes profitable, hypocrisy flourishes. A faction arose historically led by figures like Abdullah ibn Ubay, who are referred to in the text as the munafiqun, or the hypocrites. These were people who outwardly professed faith, who prayed shoulder to shoulder with the community but secretly conspired against them and only looked out for their own worldly advantage.
It's the ultimate betrayal because it's cloaked in brotherhood. And chapter 63 is entirely dedicated to them. The imagery the text uses to describe their psychology is incredibly vivid.
It is a masterclass in psychological profiling. The text says they make their oaths to serve as a cover. They use their public declarations of loyalty as a shield, while they quietly turn people away from the truth. But the most striking visual is in verse 4, where it says that when you look at them, their outward appearance might please you, and when they speak, you listen because they sound convincing. But in reality, they are like blocks of wood clad with garments.
Blocks of wood clad with garments. That is a piercing metaphor. Think about the structural reality of a block of wood. It looks solid. You can dress it up in beautiful garments. You can prop it up in the front row of the meeting. But inside, it's dead.
Completely hollow.
There is no life, no roots, no flexibility. It is propped up entirely by its outward veneer.
They are completely consumed by image management. And this connects directly to the piercing question asked in chapter 61, the ranks. The text confronts the believers and asks, why do you say that which you do not do?
And the text doesn't just treat this as a minor character flaw. It says, it is most hateful to Allah that you should say that which you do not do. The lack of internal integrity, the gap between your professed values and actual actions is treated as the ultimate internal rot.
Because if a society or an individual loses that alignment between word and deed, it will inevitably collapse under its own weight, regardless of how strong its iron or military defenses are. And chapter 64 takes this exploration of the internal enemy even deeper, digging into the foundational motivations that cause us to become hypocrites in the first place.
Chapter 64, the manifestation of defects. This chapter is fascinating because it points to the very things we usually consider our greatest blessings and calls them a threat. It warns that one's own wealth and children are a trial. The Arabic word is fitna. Now, I want to clarify this because it feels like a contradiction. Earlier, we said you should engage in commerce and build wealth. So why is having a family and money suddenly labeled a trial?
This requires careful philosophical discernment. When the text calls wealth and children a trial or a fitna, it absolutely does not mean that having a family or making a living is inherently evil.
Right. It's not telling you to abandon your kids and burn your money.
Exactly. What it means is that our deepest, most primal attachments, our intense desire to hoard wealth for our own security, or our biological drive to advance our children's status at any cost, often become the exact rationalizations we use to act unjustly toward others. They become the catalyst for our hypocrisy.
I see this constantly in modern life. Nobody wakes up in the morning, looks in the mirror and says, I'm going to be an evil, corrupt hypocrite today.
No, never.
No, they say, I need to secure this lucrative contract so my kids can go to a better school, and if I have to lie or completely crush a competitor to do it, I'm justified because I'm just being a good provider for my family.
Yes. We weaponize our love for our inner circle to justify our cruelty to the wider world. The noble desire to protect your family becomes the psychological excuse to be ruthless in business. That is the fitna. That is the trial. The test is, will you maintain the balance of justice when your own wealth or your own family's advantage is directly on the line?
Or will you compromise your integrity to secure their position? Chapter 64 gives a terrifying lens through which to view this trial. It talks about the day of gathering, which refers primarily to the day of resurrection, but the text literally names it the day of the manifestation of defects.
It's a profound philosophical reality. The idea is that all hidden motivations, all secret treacheries, all the times you played the block of wood clad in garments, it will all eventually be dragged into the blazing light. You cannot hide your internal reality forever.
If we look at this through a modern psychological lens, it perfectly mirrors the concept of cognitive dissonance, or the Jungian shadow self. When our actions don't match our professed values, the psychological toll is devastating. We spend so much frantic energy managing the garments, trying to make the block of wood look alive, that we lose our actual souls in the process.
The stress of maintaining the illusion eventually destroys us. The manifestation of defects is inevitable, whether in an afterlife or in the psychological breakdown of the individual.
So here is the integrity audit for you as you navigate your week. Where in your life are you currently a block of wood clad with garments? Where are you saying all the right things in the corporate meeting or on social media, but doing the exact opposite in private? And more uncomfortably, where are you letting the desire to protect your in-group turn into an excuse to be ruthless toward outsiders?
It demands an exhausting level of total honesty with oneself.
It really does. Which naturally leads me to ask, if we actually do all this, if we engage with the world justly, protect the vulnerable, maintain justice with our enemies, and conquer our own hypocrisy, what is the ultimate point? Where does this intense spiritual journey actually lead? Does it just end in some static reward?
That brings us to our final exploration: endless evolution and personal responsibility. We find this profoundly addressed in Chapter 66, The Prohibition. This chapter reveals that spiritual growth is entirely individual and it never, ever stops.
I love this chapter. But before we get to the concept of infinite progression, we have to talk about the title, The Prohibition, because it contains a surprisingly domestic historical anecdote about the Prophet Muhammad himself.
Yes. The chapter opens with a very gentle but firm reprimand to the Prophet. The historical context, which is heavily discussed in the commentaries, involves a domestic dispute. The Prophet, seeking to please some of his wives who were perhaps jealous about a particular domestic arrangement, most commentators cite a story where he was spending extra time consuming a specific honey drink with one of his wives. He swore an oath to temporarily forbid himself from consuming that honey.
So basically, to keep the peace in his busy household, he says, fine, I swear I won't drink the honey anymore. Problem solved.
Exactly. It was a personal sacrifice to manage domestic harmony. But the divine revelation comes down and immediately corrects him. It says, O Prophet, why do you forbid yourself that which Allah has made lawful for you, seeking to please your wives?
This is such a profound lesson in religious psychology. It's saying that even the Prophet himself cannot invent new religious burdens or deny himself inherently lawful pleasures simply out of social pressure or a desire to appease people.
It establishes a fundamental ironclad principle. True religion is not about arbitrary deprivation. You do not gain spiritual points by making your life unnecessarily hard or by forbidding what is inherently good and lawful.
God defines the boundaries, not human pressure and not creating asceticism. It is the ultimate defense against religious extremism or puritanical overreach, where people constantly try to outpious each other by inventing stricter rules.
Exactly.
But what really blew my mind in this chapter was the commentary on verse 8, regarding what happens after this life.
Yes, the concept of the believer's light. This is one of the most sublime theological concepts in the text.
The verse speaks of the believers on the day of judgment, with their light running before them, and they are actively praying, Our Lord, make perfect for us our light. And the commentary points out something mind-bending. It explains that in this tradition, paradise is not a static state of endless leisure. It's not the cartoon image of sitting on a cloud playing a harp and being bored for eternity.
The commentary argues something far more dynamic. It posits that every stage of excellence attained in the afterlife merely reveals a higher, more profound stage to aspire to, because human perfection is always relative and limited, while the divine is absolute and infinite. Therefore, the spiritual journey doesn't end when you cross the finish line into paradise. It is a state of ceaseless, infinite spiritual advancement. Even in paradise, you are always praying to have your light made more perfect.
It's endless evolution. I find that so incredibly empowering. Think of it like exploring a fractal or engaging in high-level scientific discovery. Every single answer you find just opens up a dozen more fascinating questions. The idea that growth is the eternal default state of the human soul means we are designed to constantly expand. And that theological concept of individual expansion ties directly into how Chapter 66 ends, which is an absolute masterclass in personal, individual responsibility.
The chapter concludes by presenting 4 women as stark parables for the believers and the unbelievers. And these parables systematically dismantle the deeply entrenched human idea that your spiritual fate is somehow tied to your family lineage or your physical proximity to other people.
Break down the dynamics of these 4 women for us, because the contrasts are brilliant.
First, the text gives the example of the wives of 2 great prophets, Noah and Lot. Both of these women were unrighteous and betrayed their husbands' missions. The theological lesson is brutal but necessary. Being married to a prophet, living in the exact same house as a holy person, or having a pristine religious pedigree cannot save you if your own internal compass is broken. Proximity to goodness is not a substitute for personal integrity.
You cannot ride the coattails of your family's righteousness. Your parents' faith doesn't transfer to you by osmosis.
Precisely. And then the text flips the dynamic entirely. It gives the example of the wife of Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh is the ultimate archetype of tyranny and arrogance in the Qur'an, yet his wife was a righteous believer who prayed for deliverance. Her environment was the absolute epitome of corruption, yet she maintained her complete spiritual autonomy.
And finally, it highlights Mary, the mother of Jesus, who guarded her chastity and believed in the words of her Lord, standing entirely on her own faith despite the immense social accusations against her.
Together, these four examples prove a universal truth. An oppressive, toxic environment cannot destroy your spiritual autonomy, just as a righteous, privileged environment cannot artificially manufacture it for you.
In our modern translation, this is the ultimate antidote to both toxic entitlement and paralyzing victimhood. You are not saved by your family's good name or prestige, and you are not inherently doomed by your family's generational trauma or toxic environment. Your spiritual trajectory, your internal light, is entirely in your own hands.
You are individually, solely responsible for your own infinite progression.
So ask yourself right now, are you waiting for someone else to save you? Are you expecting your partner, your religious community, or your family to do the heavy lifting in your personal growth? And conversely, how does viewing your life as an infinite, eternal progression change how you handle today's failure? If you have forever to perfect your light, maybe you don't have to be paralyzed by the mistakes you made yesterday. You have the space to grow.
It gives you the ultimate grace to repent, reset, and keep moving forward, knowing the journey is eternal.
We've covered massive ground today. We've moved from the iron of civilization to the radical equity of the vulnerable, to maintaining justice with our enemies, to the brutal battle against our own internal hypocrisy, and finally to the infinite evolution of the soul. And I want to leave you with a final thought that builds on Chapter 64's terrifying yet clarifying concept, the manifestation of defects.
It's a heavy thought.
It is. Because we don't actually have to wait for an afterlife to experience a version of this phenomenon anymore. In today's digital age, the internet acts as a permanent worldly manifestation of defects. Our past actions, our hidden comments, leaked emails, secret hypocrisies, the way we treat people when we think no one is looking at, is constantly being dragged into the blazing light of the public square.
That's a very sobering reality.
If we lived every single day deeply aware that our internal defects, our true motivations, and our secret compromises would eventually be fully visible to everyone around us, how would that instantly change the way you treat the person sitting right in front of you today? Would you still act like a block of wood clad in beautiful garments? Or would you finally align your actions with your words, pick up the iron, and balance the scales? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.